Hello, everyone. It's Sanjel here from the Baha'i Blog team. I'm joined by Arthur Dahl, and we're going to have a special conversation in honor of Earth Day. I thought, Arthur, if it's all right with you, as a way of introducing yourself, I know you mentioned to me that you were involved in the very first Earth Day, so I thought maybe we could start there and talk about that.
Okay, well, I studied biology back in the early 1960s with people who later became important environmental leaders like Paul Ehrlich and Peter Raven. And then I did my PhD at Santa Barbara on marine biology. And of course, the Santa Barbara oil spill of 1969 was what triggered, the creation of Earth Day. Because here you had this, offshore drilling that didn't properly line the wells. The oil came bubbling out, and it took some time to drill other wells down to try to block it. And so it's just going on and on and on. And of course, Santa Barbara is a very touristy area with lots of wealthy people, and to have its beaches plastered with layers of oil was very dramatic. And since I was doing research on things on the beach, I was doing flooding pollution by default. I was wading through this because I knew what it was like before and it could look impact. So I was sort of thrown into the middle of the environmental crisis in a very, very immediate way.
Yeah.
So when I went to Washington Smithsonian Institution, I was very much up on those issues. And so the first Earth Day in 1970 in Washington, they were looking for speakers who would go to the different universities and schools and so on and so forth with Earth Day events. So I volunteered. And they sent me to one of the biggest high schools in the Washington area, where I spoke to a large assembly about the environmental problems of the world and pollution, and particularly what I experienced in Santa Barbara, since I'd been directly involved in that. And the problems of destruction of nature and all the things, the environmental problems as we knew them at the time. So I was right there on the ground floor of Earth Day, trying to make people sensitive, and young people in particular, of course, are interested in these things. So the very responsive audience at the high school, we had wonderful conversation. So yes, I've been working on this for a reasonably long period of time.
Yes, you've been involved in well, you're the president of the International Environment Forum, and I know that you're a retired senior official for the UN as it relates to environment. So you have been involved in this conversation, I think, for a very, very long time. How do you feel about Earth Day now?
Well, it's a shame we still have to have Earth Day in a sense. We've been trying for so much long time to get the world to turn around and away from these environmental problems, and if they still keep getting worse and worse. In 1972, there was the first UN conference on the human environment in Stockholm, and I was there representing the Baha'i international community. Which was already, of course, accredited to the UN. It was the first time that civil society organizations were allowed to come to a big UN conference. And so, again, I was there. We had, of course, other civil society things as well. Of course, Greenpeace had their giant whale to march in the streets and so on. But I was in the intergovernmental sessions trying to find a time when I could speak. And finally, one of the first chairmen said, civil society has their own thing. We don't need to involve them. And this is governments here. But then there was another chairperson who was more open. And so someone said the next speaker is the Baha'i international community. So I was able to ask the governments to include cooperation with civil society organizations, as part of the response, because we could deal with things like values and motivation and so on and so forth that they couldn't deal with so easily. And so there was a complementarity, and we then worked together into the Stockholm Action Plan. So we sort of try to help already at that open the door to being involved in these discourses. And so the process sort of continued from there on. Then, then 2 years later, I had probably the best job I could have in my field at the National Museum of Natural History, doing any research I wanted anywhere in the world I wanted. And I was studying coral reefs because I wanted to understand the Baha'i principle of unity and diversity in nature. How does nature do it? Yeah. So I picked the most complicated ecosystem in the world, the coral reef. So if I can study it there, that will say something about maybe ways this will apply to what we're trying to do, with the whole world and bringing unity and diversity together. And I saw in that case that it's based on cooperation. It's based on symbiosis, things working together. The more you have cooperation and collaboration, the more different things are helping each other, the richer the system becomes, the more diverse, the more productive, even in a resource-poor environment.
Yeah.
And so it was a wonderful example to learn from. And of course, that then led to my next job, because then I had gone to a Baha'i youth conference in Samoa in 1969. And one of the Baha'is there said, well, we have a regional organization called the South Pacific Commission. And, it's all the island countries and territories that work together on public health, on economic development, on social development. They should have an ecologist.
Yes.
So I wrote them and said, would you like to hire an ecologist? And they said, well, in fact, they just had a meeting on nature conservation. Would I send in an application? I did. I didn't get the money for it. So, I kept my job at the Smithsonian. I had a permanent lifetime position there. And then 5 years, I got a telegram from the commission. We now have money for that job you applied for. Are you still interested? And since I'd always wanted to be a Baha'i pioneer, ever since I was 10 years old, and I went to the conference in 1953, launching the World Crusade. And, I saw my friends getting all the volunteer to go to all these wonderful places. I couldn't go at 10 years old, but it was always my goal in life was someday to be a Baha'i pioneer. So suddenly here I could go to New Caledonia and become an environmental advisor to all the Pacific Island countries. So I went off to New Caledonia and began building a regional environmental program, of all the island countries, which now is a separate intergovernmental organization with a staff of 150 and working on climate change, other things all across the region. But at that time, I was doing all by myself for the first 8 years, just getting it off the ground, but trying to design something that was not just, the Western view of science, parks and, you keep people out and you protect things for nature. There were going to be islands for science, with no people on them. But with the cultural values of the indigenous people of the islands, they were part of nature. They took care of nature. They were responsible for it. This was their ancestors. And so you had to design a program that was responsive to those values and those needs. And in fact, there's just been a PhD dissertation done at Oxford University by a Rhodes Scholar, which did the history of that period. And he said, in fact, that kind of thinking from what I was doing, crept up into the global level, with Maurice Strong, who was the Secretary General of the Stockholm Conference, and who had come to visit me for 4 days in New Caledonia in 1974, and then spoke about that. And so we helped to influence the idea of sustainability and sustainable development as something more whole, more values-oriented, looking at the long term and so on and so forth. So, and then, of course, then I was in the Secretariat for the Rare Earth Summit in 1992, writing that part of Agenda 21, and so was able to bring the island values and ideas into the concept at that level as well. So, yes, I keep working on this, still working on it today.
I feel like, that this idea of participating in public discourses, this call of the Universal House of Justice for us to participate meaningfully in the discourses in which we are involved, is something that you have been doing for decades and have a wealth of experience in. I was wondering how being a Baha'i influences the discourses in which you participate, but also how did the discourses influence your Baha'i life?
Oh, well, as I say, in a sense, I've dedicated my life to that. And in fact, there was a point in New Caledonia when there was a revolution. My kids were having trouble in school because we were on the side of the native people against the colonists, so to speak, and it was, quite difficult. And so we wrote the House of Justice and said, again, my job was coming to an end there anyway. So I said, do we stay at our post? Do we go somewhere else? What do we do? And we had advice back saying, please try to settle in a French-speaking country, including France, and work to develop the relationship between the Baha'i international community and the United Nations. And thank you for services in the Pacific. So already at that time, my direction was clear, to work in public discourse to try to bring Baha'i principles into the United Nations. And so, yes, and of course, as you say, it goes both ways. But of course, having learned from the environment and learned from my own biological work the importance of these principles of unity. And so I've been able to illustrate the discourse with scientific values and scientific principles and scientific facts, which gives a lot of sort of strength. You don't just talk about religion as it's really the science and religion in complementarity. And at the same time, the Baha'i values go beyond just the science. The science to people change their behavior. You want people to change their behavior, you have to also touch them in their heart, touch their feelings, touch their emotions. And that's where, the faith side of things can make a big difference. So I've also been involved in that discourse for a long time. There was a time when the WWF wanted to organize a World Summit on Religions and Conservation. And so this was going to be held at Windsor Castle in 1995. And they invited all of the religious leaders of the world to come and talk about the issues of nature, protecting of nature. And so the Pope didn't come, but he sent his leading advisor. And there was the Archbishop of Canterbury and the head of the Orthodox Church and the head of Mongolian Buddhism and one of the leading Hindu scholars of India, Ruhia Khanim, and a whole delegation from the Baha'i community. And I was sent by the UN to present the issues to the religious leaders. They wanted, and so I was there, telling them about the environmental problems and so on and so forth. And after 4 days of debate at Windsor Castle, they said, we all agree. All the religions, when it comes to stewardship for the environment, for nature, responsibility, the faith traditions say all say the same thing. We can work together. And so that was another sort of special moment. And then we had another occasion some time later when there was going to be a big climate meeting in Copenhagen to try to solve the climate problem, the conference of the parties in 2009. And they were afraid they weren't going to succeed. So UNDP said, let's invite all the religions to prepare action plans on climate change. And again, back to Windsor Castle to present the action plans to Prince Philip and Ban Ki-moon, Secretary of the United Nations. So I was there with the representative of the Baha'i international community to present the Baha'i Action Plan on climate change to Ban Ki-moon and Prince Philip. And so, we work back together, sort of back and forth. And, when the Baha'is were joining the Alliance of Religions and Conservation, they asked me to prepare sort of a basic working document. So I pulled together all the Baha'i principles I could find into a document, which became the Baha'i submission to this document, where they were accepted as the sixth religion to join, this Alliance of Religions and Conservation. And I've often been asked to help in drafting BIC statements and then presenting them in one place or another. I've never been employed by BIC, but we work very closely together. I continue to do so today.
So what advice would you have? I feel this is your work and your contributions have been at a very high level in terms of international governance. What does participating in this discourse look like for someone like me, who is not in these official spheres? How do I kind of advance understandings of what we need to do to tackle this climate crisis just as a normal person?
Well, this is part of the challenge of dealing at multiple levels of discourse.
Yes.
And already in the Environment Forum, our focus has been focusing on, Baha'i-inspired discourse on environment. And as a professional organization, we're accredited by the UN in the Science and Technology Major Group.
Yeah.
But when they came out with the Sustainable Development Goals, which we had helped to develop, we said, how do we translate these down to the individual and the community level? So we sort of rewrote them to bring them down to that level. And we held a whole conference at Nur University in Bolivia to present this idea for, we don't have to be only at the global level what governments can do. We also can say some of the things you can do yourself. Talk about eliminating poverty. Well, is there poverty in your community? Can you do something to see that, is there somebody who really needs help? Of course, Abdu'l-Baha was always helping the people who were poor. And for each of the sustainable goals, we can say, how does this translate down to what people can do themselves at their own level? And of course, with climate change, the more we know about it, the more science says what we have to do. Then we have to say, what does our behavior have to change? How do our desires need to change? It used to be people wanted a great big fancy car to drive around and impress people. But when you realize the damage being done by driving cars and using the fossil fuels and so on and so forth, then maybe there are other kinds of transportation that are more reasonable, respectful for the future. And of course, we know already, in terms of the Baha'i concept of living, living a simple life leaves more room for spiritual things. We're not supposed to be attracted by the materials. If we detach the material side of life, meeting basic needs, yes, not being totally aesthetic, but at the same time not going overboard. I mean, if you simply look at the advice that Baha'u'llah gave to the Sultan of Turkey, when he went to Constantinople, and he wrote the Sultan, he said, he'd seen the ministers in the government, with all the wealth that they were accumulating and so on. He said, give to them on what they need and not that which exceedeth them. that allows them to embellish their persons and deck their homes and embellish their homes and things that are of no use to them. Give them, what their basic needs, but not more than that. So you have a definition. What should be the salary of a minister? It should be enough to live on, but not more than that. One should not be seeking positions in government for the power, for the wealth, for the corruption, or whatever it may be. So already at that level, but this will translate down to every individual as well. What do you really need? And of course, the same thinking can apply responding to climate change. What do I need with respect to climate change? Maybe since we know that for instance, eating meat generally tends to be very bad for the climate, particularly if you're eating lamb or beef. Cows and sheep, as they digest, they produce a lot of methane. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas. And therefore, they are a major sort of one of the greenhouse gases causing climate change. And methane has just been recently in the short term, it's much more damaging than carbon dioxide. It doesn't last as long in the atmosphere, but it has 80 times the global heating value. And so between the methane that leaks out of fossil fuel installations, and they waste a lot and burn off a lot, or just and what comes from agriculture, these are major contributions. And it's very easy to say, well, I'm going to eat less meat. I'm not saying you have to stop entirely. Of course, Abdu'l-Baha said, the future is with nuts and grains. The time will come when meat will no longer be eaten. So, there's an encouragement there at the same time. If somebody was not well, he'd cook a chicken for them or something like that, because he knew they needed some protein. So it's not necessarily an extreme thing. In fact, early in my career, when I was an auxiliary board member, and my counselor had been a vegetarian for much of his life with his wife. And they'd gone on pilgrimage at the time of the Guardian. And so, they came to dinner the first evening, and, sitting at the table with the Guardian. And the ladies of the household brought out a nice leg of lamb and placed it on the table. Rikki Khanum turned to Shoghi Effendi and said, Shoghi, the Batrik's a vegetarian. So he was there, serving each people, carving the leg of lamb. And when it came in, he put a piece of meat on their plate and said, it won't do them any harm. So be detached from them. Don't cling, if the Guardian serves you something, you obey the Guardian. What are your priorities? And so I think that's just the attitude. We're not extremist, but at the same time, we can be moderate. We can, say, well, maybe if I need it for some reason, for health reasons, a little bit of fish or something like that may be appropriate. But I think that's the kind of thinking that we can do in our own circumstance. Of course, if you are an Inuit in the far north and don't have anything to eat but meat, then clearly it's unreasonable to think that you have to go to a vegetarian diet, which is why you need that diversity around the world. But
that's right. I try, I'm a mother of 3 kids, and I feel like since becoming a mother, I've changed my habits. I've taken a greater sense of stewardship of how much we use, how much we waste, and making sure that things get reused, that we're using secondhand items, and that we're not generating a lot of waste as a family. But I will admit, sometimes it feels like you're facing a mountain. And I also try to be moderate, not to be too rigid in my thinking, but I feel like sometimes it feels like it's a lot. You're up against a lot. And especially the children, they see the other kids and what they have in their lunches and these beautifully packaged, individually packaged treats, and they look so appealing and so appetizing. And I feel like it's hard. It's not always easy to maintain moderation.
But that's part of education, and educating our children and explaining why.
Yeah.
I mean, if you just simply know you can't have that, then but if you say, well, one, it has a plastic packaging. Plastic is an enormous pollution. It goes into the sea, and some fish will swallow it, and will die from that. Or so they can see there's a reason why. And too much sugar, you then you can be you're overweight. It's you've got all these starving people, all these overweight people in the world because of the 2 extremes. Mm-hmm. So yes, it's partly a question of education. So they see a reason why it, and they can see there's a value of why it, and those values are important. And so little by little. But of course, in a society where there's so much advertising and there's so much push to consumerism, it's a constant challenge to resist those temptations, to realize how much we're being manipulated by the media. I learned that lesson very early. When I must have been, I don't know, 6 or 7 years old, I was sitting in the car. I think we were going on vacation in the mountains or like that. And I found myself singing to myself, Winston tastes good like a cigarette should. Oh my goodness, I don't like tobacco smoke. Why am I singing that? And I realized I'd heard it so often on the radio that it had been sort of sunk into my, my unconscious. And about there I was singing it. So I think that's just, these are the lessons as we go through, and you discover new things. Oh, I could have done that. I never thought about that part of my life before. And oh, there's a way I can do that better and consume less. And maybe I don't need to get something new here. I can reuse something and so on. And so I think you all through, and of course, sometimes different. I mean, it may well be if you just take a few little pictures, a very simple camera is fine. My wife was a professional filmmaker. She needed a very good camera in order to make the films that she was doing. And it was a perfectly reasonable expenditure, in order to do that. So I think that's where, you can't impose decisions on others. For myself in my life, for our family, what is relevant, maybe from time to time we can let children try something, but then explain why. Too much, moderation on a special occasion for a birthday, so they can have a nice birthday cake full of sugar and so on and so forth, not necessarily every day of the year.
Well, these days that we're living in with the climate crisis, just before we started recording, you mentioned the trees that have fallen down. A few months ago, we experienced a very, very, very devastating post-tropical storm. And it was quite the wake-up call for a lot of people. And I feel like now for my children, before when I was saying, oh, well, the plastic will end up in the ocean and will kill the fish, that didn't mean so much to them. But now it's very clear the effects of our overconsumption that is on the planet. And it's scary.
We're just reading a report that, in fact, more and more we're seeing combined catastrophes, 2 or 3, cyclones or hurricanes in a row, within a few days or of a few weeks, or multiple crises one on top of the other, because they get more extreme, they get more frequent, and so, and this is just the report was saying this may be the first of the climate tipping points that we've gone beyond. The warning that we're going too far and it's going to accelerate very quickly if we don't respond, and we have to respond within this decade. By 2030, we need to have turned the corner, and even that may be too late. And yet, all the forces are resisting that. The oil companies, and the major, countries that depend on oil revenues, do everything possible to delay, to postpone, and so on and so forth. And so, and we have to, the inertia is there.
That's right.
Because sometimes, I sort of feel, well, and we're told by the House of Justice, either we can make these transitions through an active consultative will, or we can wait until catastrophe forces us to change.
That's right.
And catastrophe is forcing us to change. So I then say, well, which catastrophe? And of course, there again, we don't know. Well, it's harder to, it's getting more and more clear because there's so many possible ones. But already back in the early 1950s, when Shoghi Effendi was talking about the possibility of a third world war, of a catastrophe, and so on and so forth, and he actually wrote to the American Baha'i community in 1954, saying, move out of the cities. 15 is enough to get the community. Go to the rural areas. Teaching is better there, and so on. And so, my parents moved away from San Francisco down to a more rural area at that time, responding to the call of the Guardian. But at the same time, Leroy Owis and Zoe Iowas were helping the Guardian at the time. And therefore, they were at the table as he talked with the Pilgrims and was sharing the stories that became the Pilgrims' notes from that time. And Leroy asked Shoghi Effendi at some point, when is this going to happen? And he said, I don't know. That's up to God. So if the Guardian didn't know, then how are we going to know?
Yeah.
But I sort of say today, well, if we're imagining we could have a third world war, that's one of the catastrophes that seems more and more likely, so to speak. In fact, I just saw a study recently looking at if there were a nuclear war with a nuclear winter, who might survive on the planet? And they said, well, those in the southern hemisphere, because presumably in the northern hemisphere, have a better chance of surviving, and countries that more or less can feed themselves and don't depend on the rest of the world, like Australia or New Zealand or Vanuatu or the Solomon Islands, or the countries that were mentioned, would have the best chance of getting through this and rebuilding on the other side.
Yeah.
And of course, we have a beautiful house of worship in Vanuatu and so on and so forth. So, those countries are far ahead of us already in their spiritual transition. But I sort of think, well, maybe I've often thought, the best catastrophe would be a financial if there was there's so much of a debt bubble out there. If the dollar became worthless, the banks failed, and therefore there could be no more trade, and therefore no more trade in fossil fuels, and therefore we might be saved from a climate catastrophe. What else would shut off the excess consumption of fossil fuels in time to allow us to make the transition? So in terms of avoiding some catastrophes, we may want to say, let's look forward to another. And I just saw headlines this morning, are we now seeing the beginning of a collapse in the banking system? So maybe it's happening already. Or maybe by the time you post this blog on the website, it may already have happened. Who knows how fast this may go.
So aside from specific catastrophes, Arthur, what gives you hope?
Well, obviously the Baha'i faith gives me hope. This wonderful vision of, the emerging world civilization, the ever-advancing world civilization on a very different basis. And of course, we know to do that, we need a very different kind of economic system. That is not a materialist system driven more and more wealth, more and more growth, and so on and so forth. And we've got a lot of guidance from the House of Justice about the principles we need for an alternative economic system. So we already have, in a sense, a blueprint. We don't have the details.
Yeah.
They have to be worked out. But we already have the principles to be applied and so on. So that's already hopeful to see a direction to take. And then, of course, you look at this beautiful statement from the Baha'i international community, one planet, one habitation.
Yes.
This was prepared for the Stockholm Plus 50 conference last year, where, again, I took part. And in fact, to demonstrate sustainability, I wore the same jacket there that I'd worn 50 years before at the conference in 1972. It's like, you can be sustainable. You don't have to keep changing your clothing all the time and so on to keep your weight down. And it's a beautiful statement that talks about our relationship with nature and the need to be trustees of nature and the need, to change the economic system. And it criticizes the problems of the economic system and the overconsumption of natural resources and the destruction of nature, and the need for harmony of science and religion, and the importance of the religious values to help us make that transition, and the vision that can come out of that. So it's a beautiful statement. It's a bit complex. In fact, I've been leading study classes on it at the moment but it takes 6 hours to get through it in detail. But we have that kind of thing that looks realistically at what the problems are and says these are the ways forward.
Yeah.
Now, how can you not be full of hope when you have divinely guided directions forward that we can take? And we're told, well, build your local communities. If we have some kind of a crisis, the best thing to have is community solidarity.
Yes.
And that is our priority. Build those relationships, work with other people, see how we can collaborate together. Those are the foundations for whatever may come ahead. It's not that we can escape from it, but that's the best thing we can do because we know we have to have a transition. We know how much the world has to change. And I did one thought at one point, because I worked in the UN System-Wide Earthwatch. My job in the UN in the last 10 years was sort of coordinating the whole monitoring of the global environment and all the problems that might come and how we might respond to it with the satellite missions and the scientific studies and all the different assessments and so on. So I was looking at the overall picture. And that was a very nice exercise in the sense that it allowed me to sort of think, what are some of the challenges that are coming and how can we work around them in one way or another? And so, that's where, having the Baha'i solutions, having the Baha'i direction shows, well, in fact, we have that. We know where we need to go.
Yeah.
At the same time, you imagine different kinds of, you might say, crises that could happen. One that I saw in the scientific literature, hardly anybody talks about, is that there could be a giant solar flare, a coronal mass ejection. We don't know how often these things happen from the sun, when suddenly a lot of energy comes shooting out into space. The last time it happened was, I think, in 1859. And it broke through the manosphere that protects us from radiation around the planet. And it created such a surge of electrical energy at the surface that the telegraph operators who were sending telegraph, one was knocked unconscious, it set fires, they got terrible shocks from it. If that happened today, it could grill everything electrical and electronic on the planet.
Uh-huh.
Now imagine where would be if suddenly no digital backup, no smartphone, no electricity, where would we be? And how dependent have we become on that technology, which is vulnerable to something that is even beyond our control? Yep. It's just an act of nature. So these things sort of say, well, learn to be detached. Don't be so dependent on things. Try to live a simple life, so you won't be shocked so much if these things happen. And at the same time, educate others. That's why education for responsible lifestyle, education for climate literacy, to understand the science, to know why we need to do these things, why different actions that we do are contributing in some way to the problems that we're facing, and how we can at our own little level begin to make changes and then encourage others to do as well and build a movement in the right direction. We know disintegration and integration are two simultaneous processes. The world is disintegrating. We can't do much about it except sort of try not to stand in the way too much. We can do an awful lot about the world that is integrating. And that's what Baha'i communities are working on.
That's right. That's right. And I think that the guidance and our work to build communities, as you mentioned before, either we're going to do it or the crises are going to force us to do it. And I saw it myself, when we had this major storm, there was people without electricity for weeks. And we know, we have a good idea of who our neighbors are, but you definitely get to know your neighbors a lot better when everybody is outside. There's no one to call. There's nothing to do. There's no TV to watch and everybody's outside. And then you start to have conversations and you're better able to help one another. So either we build it or we will be forced to build communities and get to know one another.
And that reminds me, that beautiful film that was made on Tana in Vanuatu, after they were hit by Chebyl cyclone, and they're the most catastrophe hit country in the world. They have all kinds of things that can happen to them. They have active volcanoes and earthquakes and tsunamis and cyclones and all these things. And so they were hit by one of the strongest cyclones in history. And the next morning, the junior youth are out there cleaning up the streets because they had learned how to do altruistic purpose. The local assemblies meetings there, what do we do to respond to those? How can we help the old people? How do we rebuild here? And so they didn't wait for any help to come from outside. They knew they had the capacity to respond, and they responded.
Yeah. Well, Arthur, I want to thank you so much for this conversation. You have given me a lot to think about. I feel like you've given me things to think about in different perspectives that I hadn't thought about before, especially about the role of religion as it relates to climate. And I'm really grateful to you for your time and for your insights.
Well, that's why we have religion. It's bringing us all things we don't have in our material society, bringing us back into balance. And so the harmony of science and religion, in a sense, my life has been that, I became a scientist because of, the Baha'i belief in science and religion. And I've been extremely active at the same time on the faith side because I've seen how it's a complement to what I do. And, I've tried as far as possible to maintain that harmony, in my own life and to encourage others and to inspire young people and everything else that can do to bring change as fast as we can because we need it.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your wonderful work.
Thank you. All right. Take care.
Okay, you too.